The lake looked frozen, solid, safe. It wasn't. On that cold morning in 1242, an army of crusaders rode across the ice, chasing what they thought were peasants fleeing in fear. But waiting on the far shore was a man who understood the cold better than faith. Prince Alexander Nevsky. He didn't meet their strength with strength. He let the lake decide. When the charge began, the ice groaned. When the spears met, it cracked, and when the shouting stopped, the water spoke louder than war. This is how a frozen lake devoured an army, and how a prince no one expected to win did. They came across the frozen lake like ghosts in white armor. The Teutonic Knights, Europe's holy warriors mailed from head to heel, rode east with banners of the cross and the certainty of divine favor. Behind them marched men hardened by a century of crusade, German knights, Danish lords, Livonian mercenaries. In their eyes, the land beyond the lake was pagan, untamed, a frontier to be claimed in the name of God. They expected fear. They found silence. On the far side of the lake waited the army of Novgorod. Peasants, hunters, fishermen, a few scattered boyars who could still afford a horse. They were led by Prince Alexander Nevsky, a young noble who had already learned the oldest rule of survival. You don't fight an empire on its terms. You make it fight on yours. The lake was called Peipus, vast, flat, and in early spring, frozen, almost solid. The ice stretched so far that horizon and sky blurred into one colorless sheet. Beneath that thin shell, black water moved, slow, heavy, waiting. Alexander knew the Crusaders believed in weight, the weight of armor, of discipline, of faith. He would let that weight pull them under. The week before the battle, scouts brought reports that the Crusaders were marching east out of Pskov. They burned villages as they went, dragging prisoners behind sleds, leaving charred earth and crosses in their wake. Their confidence was total. Every campaign they had fought in the Baltic ended the same way. Pagans scattered, cities surrendered, tribute collected. Alexander ordered his men not to meet them head-on. He had them fall back toward the lake, burning stores as they went. It looked like retreat. It was invitation. Every step backward pulled the Crusaders deeper into unfamiliar ground, thinner ice, shifting marshes, frozen rivers where the current still moved below. The winter was dying, the thaw beginning. The ice would hold, but not forever. The morning of the battle broke gray and still. Fog clung to the surface of the lake like breath. You couldn't see 50 yards. Sound moved strangely, carried by the flatness. Hooves clattering miles away sounded close. Whispers nearby felt swallowed by air. Alexander positioned his men near the eastern bank where reeds and snowdrifts disguised the shore. He had maybe 4,000 men, fewer than half what the Crusaders could field. Most were militia with axes and short spears, some with little more than hunting bows. His cavalry was small, barely a few hundred strong, but he had the one weapon the Teutonic Order didn't: knowledge of the ice. He arranged his infantry in a shallow crescent, edges hidden in fog. Behind them, on the firmer ground of the shoreline, he placed his cavalry in reserve. The order was simple: hold until the enemy was committed, then strike the flanks. He waited. Out in the fog, the Crusaders advanced. Their formation glittered faintly through the mist, a wall of steel and banners. Priests rode behind them, chanting hymns. Trumpets sounded in intervals, the rhythm steady, almost ritualistic. Each knight trusted his armor, his horse, his brother beside him. Against peasants it was enough. They saw the Russian line forming near the shore, small, ragged, uneven. They mistook it for desperation. What they couldn't see was the sheen of meltwater beneath their horses' hooves. At Alexander's signal, The front ranks of Novgorod archers loosed a first volley. The arrows fell short, clattering harmlessly on ice. It was meant to mock, to provoke. The Crusader commander, Bishop Hermann of Dorpat, gave the order that sealed his army's fate. "Forward!" The knights lowered lances and spurred their horses. The sound came first, hooves hammering the ice, echoing like distant thunder. Then came the sight. A wedge of armored riders cutting through fog, white crosses flashing, the air splitting with the rush of charge. For a few seconds, it was everything Crusaders believed war should be. Speed, faith, power made visible, but the lake had its own rhythm. The weight hit all at once. The first cracks were soft, like whispers, then sharper. The ice flexed under the charge, groaning like wood under strain. Thin veins of water spidered outward beneath hooves. The knights didn't see it, or didn't want to. They pressed on, believing the enemy would break first. Alexander watched from the shore. He didn't move. He waited until the enemy was halfway across. Then he raised his arm. Trumpets blared from the east. Russian cavalry surged out of the fog, sweeping wide around the flanks, hooves striking solid ground before spilling back onto thinner ice. The peasant infantry advanced to meet the knights head-on. Spears braced, shields locked. The clash was chaos. Steel slammed against wood. Horses reared and slipped. The fog exploded with sound, shouting in two languages, ice cracking, weapons ringing. The Crusader wedge smashed into the Russian line, driving deep at first. But every yard they gained put more weight on the ice. The first horse went down when its hoof punched through a weak patch. A second followed. The knights around them tried to maneuver, but momentum was gone. They were packed too tightly to turn, trapped by their own formation. Arrows began to fall from both flanks. Short, brutal volleys, guided by instinct more than sight. The frozen surface began to move. At first it was small, a ripple underfoot, the strange sensation of standing on something alive. Then came the fracture. A long, low crack snaked outward from the center, splitting between the hooves of men and beasts. Some ignored it, others panicked. That panic did more damage than any weapon. Alexander gave the next signal. His cavalry charged from both sides, spears angled low, striking at the flanks of the Crusader mass. The shock forced the knights inward, toward the center of the lake, toward the weakest ice. The sound changed from the clash of battle to the shattering of glass beneath a cathedral bell. Sections of ice gave way. Horses screamed as they plunged chest deep into freezing water, armor dragging them down. The front ranks tried to pull back, but the rear still pushed forward. Those who fell were trampled or swallowed by the lake. The battle was no longer a contest. It was collapse. Alexander's infantry pressed forward, driving the survivors toward shore where they could be captured or cut down. The fog hung heavy with steam from the lake's new wounds, snow turning red and gray around the edges. By midday the fighting was over. The ice was silent again except for the distant groans of trapped horses. Broken banners drifted across meltwater pools. The Crusaders' white cloaks floated like ghosts over the surface. Alexander rode out to the center with his guards, the air sharp and metallic. He looked down into the cracks where armor still glimmered below the waterline. The lake had kept its part of the bargain. He turned to his men and said only, "Let them return to God through the water they defiled." They would later call it the Battle of the Ice. By the time the last fragments of fighting ended, the fog had started to lift. The morning light revealed what victory actually looked like. The lake was broken, an expanse of shattered ice slabs, horses half submerged, banners soaked and motionless. The sound that followed the silence wasn't cheering. It was the creak of armor cooling in the wind. the low groans of survivors freezing where they stood. The Russians didn't sing. They just stared at what the lake had done. Alexander Nevsky dismounted at the shoreline, his boots sinking into slush. He didn't smile. He wasn't built for triumph. His gaze moved over the battlefield, like a man counting debts, not blessings. Behind him, the peasants and soldiers of Novgorod began dragging wounded men out of the water, friend and foe, both. Some Teutonic Knights were stripped of weapons and left alive. Others finished quickly. Mercy wasn't policy. It was weather. It came and went without warning. The Crusaders' formation had dissolved completely. The wedge that was supposed to break the Russian line had collapsed inward like a sinkhole. The ice had turned on them, every crack widening with the weight of iron and arrogance. The holy warriors of the West had drowned in armor designed to save them. For hours, the Russians worked in silence, collecting what they could. Broken shields, arrows, pieces of mail. The spoils weren't glory, they were survival. Everything that could be melted down, repaired, or traded would be. That's how peasant armies stayed alive. The truth spread slowly, moving faster than any army. Messengers carried word back to Pskov and beyond. The Teutonic order had been broken on the ice. At first, no one believed it. A handful of city militias and farmers had stopped one of Europe's most disciplined forces. It sounded like heresy, or luck at best. But then the survivors limped home, half-frozen, armorless and silent. Their silence was the proof. In Novgorod, bells rang, not for victory but for deliverance. Markets reopened, bread returned to the stalls, and Alexander, who had been a target of political jealousy before the battle, returned to the city as something closer to a legend. He didn't act like one. When the city elders asked what his strategy had been, he said only, "I let them believe the ground beneath them was safe." That was all. The Teutonic Order didn't die on Lake Peipus, but it never truly recovered from it. They would rebuild, march again, and burn more villages. But something invisible had cracked deeper than ice, the illusion of invincibility. Priests stopped promising victory. Captains started checking terrain before praying for it. Every campaign after the ice carried hesitation in its saddlebag. For Alexander's men, the memory was different. They didn't talk about faith or empire. They remembered the noise, the sound of hooves shattering under them, the screams turning to gurgles. They remembered watching their enemies vanish, not in flame or glory, but in cold silence. The lake had become a graveyard without walls. Years later, when chroniclers asked the soldiers who had been there what the battle felt like, none described tactics. They talked about the color, not red but gray, gray sky, gray water, gray faces when the ice broke. They said it was like fighting inside a dying breath. And they said Alexander never flinched once, not when the ice cracked, not when the horses screamed, not when the last of the night sank. He watched and waited until it was done, then simply turned his horse and rode back to shore. That's why they followed him after that day, not because he was royal, but because he had looked at chaos and understood it could be used as a weapon. In the years that followed, he would become a prince, a saint, and a symbol of defiance, though he never called himself any of those things. To his soldiers, he remained what he had always been, the man who made the enemy drown in their own certainty. The chronicles written centuries later tried to romanticize it, to turn the lake into a holy stage where one faith triumphed over another. But that was never the truth. There were no miracles, no divine visions, just mud, cold, and calculation. The ice didn't care about banners, it only cared about weight. And on that day, the heavier side lost. Why it mattered. The Battle of the Ice didn't redraw borders, it didn't end wars, but it rewired the idea of victory itself. For centuries, Western armies had believed that armor and discipline made them untouchable, that faith alone could harden steel. Alexander's victory broke that illusion. He proved that an army's greatest weapon isn't faith or numbers or metal. It's the understanding of where not to stand. After Peipus, every commander learned to look at terrain differently. The strongest could be trapped, the fastest could be slowed, and those who marched with certainty could vanish under their own feet. The story spread across Europe, like a warning carved into ice. The ground beneath you is never as solid as you think. As spring thawed the lake, armor rose to the surface. Fishermen found helmets tangled in reeds. Children threw stones into cracks that echoed down into the black water. No one built monuments there. They didn't need to. The lake itself remembered. The lake healed, but it never forgot. Spring came late that year, as if nature itself was wary of what lay beneath its surface. When the thaw finally came, the cracks widened and the water swallowed what remained of the crusader dead. The helmets that hadn't sunk were taken as trophies. The rest disappeared into blackness. Villagers along the shoreline said you could still hear the sound of hooves below the surface when the wind was right. They said the lake groaned like armor under strain, as if the ice still remembered the weight that broke it. And, in a way, it did. Alexander Nevsky didn't celebrate. He buried his dead first. Then he gathered what was left of the crusader weapons and had them melted down, not to build monuments, but to forge plows and axes. "Steel belongs to the living," he said. "The dead have no use for it." Those words spread farther than his banners ever had. When he entered Novgorod, there were no parades. The people lined the streets in silence as he rode through the gates. Mud still clung to his cloak, his armor still dented. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had seen how close survival comes to being luck. But luck wasn't what saved them. It was memory. He had remembered what the land could do, what ice could bear, and what pride could destroy. And because of that, an empire had been stopped by farmers. For years after, the Teutonic Order refused to speak of the battle in detail. Their chronicles called it a setback. They wrote that the barbarians had won only through terrain and trickery, never admitting that arrogance had done the work for them. But soldiers talk more honestly than historians. Those who had been there whispered that the ice itself had rebelled, that even God had turned away when faith became weight. And that whisper grew louder every winter. Decades later, the story began to shift. Minstrels sang of the knight who sank praying. Painters showed Alexander bathed in holy light as angels held the lake apart for his men. The truth, rough and gray, was polished until it gleamed. The peasants became saints. The cold became purity, and the trap became a miracle. But the real story was simpler, sharper. It wasn't faith that won, it was patience. It wasn't righteousness, it was restraint. The kind of victory that doesn't make songs, only scars. Alexander's fame spread through the principalities. When Mongols came later, it was his name that steadied the frightened. When invaders crossed frozen rivers generations after, commanders invoked Peipus before they marched. Not as inspiration, as warning, because everyone remembered what he had taught the world. Weight is only power until the ground decides otherwise. The lake remained silent for centuries. No city rose on its banks. No churches dared sanctify it. It was too pure, too dangerous, too honest. Every winter, people crossed it with caution, knowing the story wasn't just history. It was a rule written not in ink or blood, but in cracks. If you stand on that ice today, the world still feels the same. Endless, gray horizon. Cold that bites instead of kills. The air too still, too heavy. And if you listen closely, really listen, you'll hear it. Not voices, not ghosts, just that low, distant groan. The lake, remembering the day it decided who would live and who would sink.